The colonel's voice was flat, bored. "Stand down, advisor." He didn't even look at her. He looked at the chaos on the tactical map, a bloom of red icons swarming their position. The order was a dismissal, a final shove to the periphery where he believed she belonged. But Alara Vance saw the one thing they all missed: the single, fatal geometry of the attack, a flaw that could be exploited. In that moment, the battle would turn not on the weight of their firepower, but on the precise arc of a single grenade, thrown by the one person they had completely underestimated. The dry wind of the Kavda Badlands whipped dust against the transport helicopter's fuselage, a gritty preamble to her arrival at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Alara Vance stepped onto the perforated steel landing pad, her boots making a flat, solid sound that was immediately swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. She carried a single, unadorned duffel bag. Her graying hair was pulled back in a severe, disciplined knot. The lines on her face were not from age alone, but from sun and focus, etched by decades of watching horizons most people never knew existed. Two young soldiers, barely out of their teens, met her. Their movements were stiff with the formality of a duty they clearly found pointless. "Ma'am, PFC Lee. This is PFC Rostova. We're your escort to the command post." Alara gave a short, economical nod. She did not offer her name. They had it on a manifest. Anything more was unnecessary. As they walked, she absorbed the base not as a visitor, but as a diagnostician. Her gaze swept over the HESCO barriers, noting the settling of the earth beneath them, a subtle slump that suggested a rushed or improper fill. She saw the way the concertina wire was strung just a little too high off the ground in the western sector, leaving a crawl space for a determined, slender adversary. Her ears catalogued the sounds. The strained whine of a generator in need of maintenance, the irregular metallic clank from the motor pool that spoke of a loose track on a Bradley, the clipped, tense cadence of radio chatter that hummed with more anxiety than operational efficiency. The soldiers walked her past the firing range, where a squad was running through drills. Alara's pace slowed for a fraction of a second, her eyes assessing their form. They were strong, earnest kids, but their movements were large, their transitions from standing to kneeling clumsy. They flagged each other with their muzzles, a minor infraction in training that became a fatal one under fire. They reloaded with their heads down, breaking situational awareness. Little things, lethal things. Rostova, the taller of the two, seemed to notice her momentary pause. "Standard rifle qualification, ma'am." The ma'am was correct, but the tone held a faint trace of condescension, the kind a 20-year-old combat-armed soldier reserves for a civilian they assume knows nothing of their world. Alara's eyes, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold the memory of harsher light, met Rostova's. Their magazine changes are slow. They're looking at their pouches, not the threat. Rostova blinked, surprised by the specificity. Lee glanced back, his curiosity piqued. Before either could formulate a response, Alara was already moving again, her gaze having shifted to the placement of the guard towers. They were well constructed, but their fields of fire had a significant blind spot where the southern wadi curved sharply toward the base's perimeter. An entire platoon could stage there unseen until the final 100 meters of their assault. Her presence was a bureaucratic formality, she knew. A new Pentagon initiative required a senior strategic advisor to embed with forward-deployed units to assess readiness. The title was laughably vague. To the soldiers on the ground, she was just another box to check, a civilian tourist in their war, and an old one at that. They saw a woman in her late 50s, dressed in practical but unremarkable khaki trousers and a worn field jacket. They saw a name on a piece of paper. They did not see the ghost of 1,000 forgotten firefights walking among them. The command post was a pressurized container, a sterile bubble of air conditioning and flickering screens against the oppressive heat. Colonel Madsen did not rise from his chair when she entered. He was a man carved from the same hard earth as the surrounding terrain, his face a mask of sun-baked certainty. He gestured to a flimsy chair in the corner, a clear demarcation of her status. "Vance, I read your file. Logistics and procurement analysis. Impressive, I'm sure. But out here, the only logistics that matter are bullets and water." His dismissal was as clean and sharp as a bayonet. He turned back to his primary screen, where a satellite feed showed the sprawling, empty desert. You're here for 2 weeks. Stay out of the wire, stay out of my soldiers' way, and write whatever report you need to write. My operations officer, Major Kenji, will give you the official tour. Don't wander off. Elara placed her bag beside the designated chair but did not sit. She remained standing, her posture perfectly still, forcing him to acknowledge her presence on her terms. The room was thick with the low hum of electronics and the smell of stale coffee. On the wall behind Madsen's desk hung a collection of framed unit citations and a captured enemy flag, trophies of a career built on direct, overwhelming force. He was a hammer, and to him every problem was a nail. He prided himself on aggression, on tempo, on the relentless application of firepower. Her file, she knew, would be a carefully sanitized document. It would say she had worked for the Department of Defense for 30 years. It would list her expertise in supply chain vulnerabilities and threat assessment matrices. It would be technically true and entirely misleading. It would not mention the operations that were never filed, the units that never officially existed, or the name she had once answered to in the dark. "Colonel," she said, her voice even and low, cutting through the electronic hum. "My mandate is to observe all aspects of unit readiness. That includes defensive posture and tactical response." Madsen finally swiveled his chair, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Your mandate is to advise on strategy. Let me give you my strategy. We find the enemy, and we kill them. It's been working just fine. We don't need a procurement analyst from the Pentagon telling us how to sight in a machine gun." He picked up a stylus and tapped it against his screen, a gesture of impatience. "Major Kenji will show you the mess hall." A younger officer with bright, intelligent eyes stepped forward. "Ma'am, if you'll follow me." Elara gave the colonel a long, unblinking look. It wasn't a challenge. It was an assessment. She saw the rigidity in his posture, the way his jaw was set. He was a man who had been rewarded for a single methodology and was now incapable of imagining another. He was strong but brittle. He would break before he bent. She had seen men like him before. She had seen them fail. She gave a single, curt nod and turned to follow the major, leaving Madsen to his maps and his certainty. As she left, she heard him mutter to his sergeant major, 2 weeks. Just keep her occupied." The command post door hissed shut behind her, but Elara had already memorized the layout of the room, the frequencies listed on the whiteboard, the exact model of the encrypted comm suite, and the name of the software patch they were 2 versions behind on installing. Her observation had already begun. Major Kenji was professional, if a little wary. He gave her the standard tour, pointing out the barracks, the aid station, the motor pool. He spoke in the clipped, efficient language of a man with too much to do. Elara listened patiently, but her attention was elsewhere. She was building a map in her mind, one far more detailed than the one on Madsen's screen. It was a map of vulnerabilities. She walked the perimeter again, this time with a more critical eye. She stopped near the western fence line, where the concertina wire was improperly strung. She knelt, the rough fabric of her trousers scraping against the baked earth, and peered underneath. P.F. Seeley, who had been assigned the unenviable task of being her shadow for the day, shifted uncomfortably. "Problem, ma'am? A man could get under this in less than 20 seconds with a simple blanket to protect his back," she said, her voice devoid of accusation. It was a statement of fact. "The ground's eroded. The posts need to be reset and the wire lowered. And you need ground-level trip flares every 10 meters along this entire sector." Lee looked at the wire, then back at her. He had walked this line 100 times and never noticed. To him, it was just a fence. To her, it was an invitation. They continued to the motor pool. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and grease. A team of mechanics was working on the Bradley she had heard earlier, its massive track laid out on the concrete like the spine of a metal beast. She walked over, her eyes scanning the vehicle. She ran a hand along the reactive armor panels on its flank. "These bolts are over-torqued," she stated quietly, tapping one with her knuckle. A sergeant, his hands black with grime, looked up with an annoyed expression. "We use a torque wrench, ma'am. They're to spec, The wrench might be to spec, but you're getting metal fatigue around the bolt heads, she countered, pointing to hairline fractures in the composite armor, invisible to a casual glance. Under the kinetic impact of an RPG, this whole panel won't shear off like it's designed to. It'll shatter. It'll turn your own armor into spall. The sergeant stared at the tiny cracks, his mouth slightly agape. He pulled a high-intensity flashlight from his pocket and shone it on the spot. The fractures became starkly visible under the focused beam. He looked from the armor to this quiet, gray-haired woman, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than annoyance crossed his face. It was grudging respect. Later, she stood on the roof of the operations building, looking out at the sprawling landscape through a pair of battered but high-quality binoculars she produced from her bag. The sun was beginning to set, painting the Badlands in shades of orange and deep purple. The shadows grew long, transforming the terrain. The wadi she had noted earlier was now a river of blackness, a perfect, concealed avenue of approach. She wasn't just looking at the terrain. She was reading it. She saw firing lanes, dead space, choke points, and ambush sites. She saw how the setting sun would blind the sentries in the western towers for a critical 12-minute window. She saw how the prevailing wind would carry the sound of an approaching force away from the base's acoustic sensors. She mapped it all, filed it away, cross-referenced it with the base's defensive layout. She saw a catastrophe waiting to happen, a disaster choreographed by complacency. Lee stood a few feet away, silent. He had been with her all day. He had seen her notice the wire, the armor, and now he watched her study the terrain with an intensity he had only ever seen in their most seasoned scout snipers. "What do you see, ma'am?" he asked, his voice now stripped of its earlier condescension. Alara lowered the binoculars. "A problem," she said simply, and a solution. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her job was to observe and report, not to command. But the knowledge settled within her, a cold, heavy weight. She knew a storm was coming. The only question was whether anyone would listen when it broke. The first explosions came just after 0200. They were not the speculative, harassing mortar fire of a low-level threat. They were precise, coordinated strikes. The first round hit the primary generator, plunging half the base into darkness. The second hit the main communications array. Sentinel was now dark and deaf. Alarms blared, a panicked, shrieking counterpoint to the concussive crump of incoming rockets. In the command post, chaos bloomed. Young officers shouted conflicting reports into handheld radios. The backup generator kicked in, but the main tactical displays remained dark. The comms link to higher command severed. Colonel Madsen stood in the center of the room, his face illuminated by the red glow of emergency lighting, barking orders. "Get me a sit rep from the perimeter. Where is it coming from? Get air support on the horn. Comms are down, sir. We can't raise the air wing. Western perimeter is taking heavy fire. They've breached the wire." The reports cascaded, a torrent of failure. The enemy wasn't just harassing them. They were dismantling them. They had targeted the command and control nodes with surgical precision. They had exploited the very vulnerabilities Alara had noted. Through it all, Alara Vance stood by her designated chair, a pool of absolute stillness in the swirling panic. She hadn't moved. Her breathing was slow and even. Her eyes were closed, but she wasn't resting. She was listening. She listened to the cadence of the explosions, distinguishing between the sharp crack of RPGs and the deeper boom of recoilless rifles. She listened to the sound of the outgoing fire from the base's defenders, noting the frantic, undisciplined rate of fire that spoke of fear, not of effective suppression. She could hear the battle as if she were seeing it on a map. The attack was focused on the west, a feint designed to draw the base's quick reaction force. The main assault, she knew, would come from the south, up through the wadi she had watched for hours. PF Seeley, his face pale, stumbled into the command post, delivering a message from the western wall. "Sir, they're through the wire. Sergeant Hassan's squad is pinned down near Tower 3. They're using the dead space under the guns." Madsen slammed his fist on the table. "Divert Bravo Company. Now, I want that breach sealed. Sir, if we move Bravo, the southern approach is wide open, Major Kenji argued, his voice strained. The enemy is in the west. That's where the fight is. Madsen roared, his strategy of overwhelming force now a liability. He was rushing all his strength to plug a hole, ignoring the fact that the dam was about to burst elsewhere. Alara opened her eyes. She walked calmly to the large, now useless paper map on the side wall, the one they used for briefings. She picked up a red marker. "Colonel," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. It was not loud, but it had a quality of command that made 3 people stop and turn. Madsen ignored her. "I have a visual on the southern wadi," she continued, her voice level. "Thermal optics." My own, she had pulled a small, monocular device from her jacket pocket. "A company-sized element is staging at these coordinates. They will begin their final assault in approximately 90 seconds. She made a precise mark on the map, deep inside the wadi, in the exact spot she had identified hours earlier. Madsen finally turned to her, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? The fight is in the west. Who gave you clearance to?" "They're using the western attack to fix your QRF in place," Alara interrupted, her tone flat and clinical. "Their main objective is here." She tapped the map, indicating the location of the command post and the adjacent ammunition supply point. "A classic feint and strike. You have 1 platoon Charlie Company in reserve. They are your only chance." The pressure in the room became immense. The air was thick with the smell of fear and ozone. Outside, the volume of fire intensified. Every instinct Madsen had, every battle he had ever fought, told him to reinforce the sector that was actively under attack. But this quiet, infuriating woman was telling him to ignore the fire he could see and fight a ghost he could not. His career and the lives of his men hung on the next decision. "Stand down, advisor," Madsen snarled, his authority threatened, his world narrowing to the crisis he could see. "I'm not sacrificing the western wall on the word of a civilian." He turned his back on her, a final, emphatic dismissal. "Get Bravo Company moving west." But Alara was no longer looking at him. She was already moving, her steps purposeful and swift. She walked past the stunned officers, past PFC Lee, who watched her with wide, uncertain eyes, and out the door of the command post into the violent night. The air outside was a maelstrom of noise and light. Tracer rounds stitched green and red lines across the darkness. The ground shuddered with impacts. Soldiers ran past her, their faces grim, heading toward the western perimeter. Alara moved against the tide, heading south. She moved with an economy of motion that was unnerving. She didn't run. She flowed through the chaos, her head on a swivel, her senses absorbing everything. She arrived at the southern berm just as the first elements of Charlie Company were scrambling into their fighting positions. They were disorganized, expecting a quiet night, now thrown into a confusing firefight they couldn't see. A young lieutenant was trying to get them oriented, his voice cracking with stress. Alara found Sergeant Omar Hassan, a seasoned NCO whose squad had been pulled from the west to plug this gap. His face was grim. "They're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. Hassan nodded, peering over the sandbags into the darkness. "We hear him. Can't see a damn thing. They're still in the wadi down below, in the inky blackness of the gully." A machine gun opened up, its fire raking the top of the berm, forcing the soldiers to duck. It was a heavy-caliber weapon, expertly placed in a location that offered it complete protection from direct fire. It pinned down the entire platoon, preventing them from engaging the assault element that would be following close behind it. The lieutenant screamed for a grenadier, for a rocket, but the angle was impossible. The gun was tucked deep under a rocky overhang. "We can't hit it from here," a soldier yelled. "The trajectory is too high. It's completely defilated." Panic began to set in. The machine gun was systematically tearing apart their cover. In moments, the main enemy force would crest the edge of the wadi and overwhelm their suppressed position. Madsen's voice crackled over Hassan's radio. "Hassan, what's your status? I need you to suppress that southern approach." Sir, we're pinned. We have an MG in the wadi we can't touch. Alara crawled to Hassan's position. Give me a grenade, she said, her voice calm. Hassan stared at her as if she were insane. Ma'am. One fragmentation grenade. Now, there was something in her voice, a core of absolute certainty, that cut through his panic. He fumbled at his webbing and handed her a standard M67 grenade. She took it, her movements fluid and practiced. She didn't just pull the pin. She held the grenade, feeling its weight, its balance. She looked not at the enemy position, but at a large, flat rock face that formed the opposite wall of the wadi, about 50 meters away. The enemy machine gun was 30 meters below and to the right of that rock. It was an impossible shot, a geometry problem with a fatal consequence for failure. She rose to a low crouch, ignoring the bullets snapping over her head. Her arm didn't draw back in a typical throw. It was a short, precise, almost mechanical motion, more like a pitcher's throw than a soldier's. She released the grenade. It flew not in a high arc toward the enemy, but in a flat, fast trajectory across the wadi, aimed at the rock face. For a split second, everyone watched it fly, a tiny dark sphere against the dark, a fool's errand. The grenade struck the rock face with a faint tink. It didn't explode. It ricocheted. It bounced off the flat stone at a perfect 90-degree angle, dropping straight down. It fell for a second, a silent, lethal plummet, and disappeared behind the overhang where the machine gun was nested. A beat of silence. Then, a muffled, contained whump. The machine gun stopped firing. Instantly, the sudden silence was more shocking than the noise it replaced. The entire southern front went quiet. Sergeant Hassan slowly raised his head over the berm. He looked down into the wadi. Then he looked back at Alara Vance, who was already scanning the darkness for the next threat. His expression was one of profound, absolute disbelief. The change was instantaneous. It began with Sergeant Hassan. He keyed his radio, his voice no longer strained with panic but tight with awe. Command, this is Hassan. Southern MG is neutralized. I repeat, it is neutralized. There was a pause from the other end. How, Sergeant? Who had the shot? Hassan looked at Alara, who was calmly wiping the grit from her hands. Command. Stand by. He lowered the radio. The soldiers of Charlie Company were all staring. Not at the wadi, but at her. The quiet, older woman who had just done something they all knew was impossible. They had seen trick shots on the range, heard stories of legendary feats, but they had never seen anything like this. It wasn't just a good throw. It was an act of inhuman calculation. A physics problem solved under fire with a margin of error measured in inches. PFC Rostova, who had been rerouted to the southern berm with a resupply of ammunition, skidded to a halt nearby. She had seen the whole thing. Her mouth was open, her earlier condescension vaporized and replaced by sheer wonder. She looked from the silent wadi to Alara, and the dismissive label of civilian advisor shattered in her mind. This was not a logistician. This was something else entirely. In the command post, Madsen heard Hassan's report. What do you mean, stand by? How was it neutralized? He demanded. Major Kenji, who had been monitoring the southern sector's comms, looked up from his console. Sir, I have multiple reports from Charlie Company. They're all the same. The advisor, she took it out, with a single grenade. They say she bounced it off a rock wall. Madsen stared at Kenji as if the major had started speaking in tongues. Bounced it? That's not possible, but the silence from the southern front was undeniable. The linchpin of the enemy's main assault had been removed. Without the suppressive fire from that machine gun, their attack stalled. The assault teams, now exposed, began taking effective fire from Charlie Company. The momentum was broken. The southern attack was beginning to crumble. The focus in the command post shifted. The frantic energy bled away, replaced by a tense, confused quiet. All eyes kept darting to the empty chair in the corner where Alara was supposed to be. The woman Madsen had dismissed as a paper pusher, the relic he had ordered to stand down, had just saved his most vulnerable flank with a single, inexplicable act. He looked at the red mark she had made on the map. It was exactly where the enemy had been. She had been right about everything. The feint, the main assault, the location, the timing. The realization settled on him with a chilling weight. He hadn't just underestimated her. He had been blind. He had been playing checkers while she was playing a game he didn't even understand. P.F. Seeley, who had remained in the command post, looked at the colonel, then at the map. He remembered her words from the firing range, from the motor pool, from the rooftop. They hadn't been idle observations. They had been a quiet, methodical assessment of every weakness, every flaw. He looked at the officers around him, saw their confusion mirroring his own. The entire perception of Alara Vance had been irrevocably altered in the space of a single explosion. She was no longer a piece of bureaucratic baggage. She was a mystery, and in the middle of a failing defense, she had suddenly become the most important person on the base. The lull was deceptive. The enemy was wounded but not broken. They were professionals. They would adapt. The failed southern assault had cost them momentum, but the western perimeter was still a chaotic mess. Now they shifted tactics. A new series of coordinated RPG strikes began, but this time they weren't aimed at personnel. They targeted the structural weak points of the buildings, specifically the corners of the command post and the aid station. They were trying to collapse the structures, to bury the command element and the medics. It was a desperate but intelligent move. "They're trying to bring the roof down on us," Kenji shouted as the whole container shuddered violently, dust and ceiling particles raining down. The lights flickered and died again as the backup generator took a near hit. The emergency reds kicked back in, casting long, dancing shadows. Madsen stood frozen for a second, his playbook empty. His strategy of aggressive counterattack was useless against this. He was in a reactive posture and he was losing. Then the door opened. Alara stepped back inside. She was covered in dust, but her eyes were clear and calm. She walked directly to the tactical map board, ignoring the colonel. Every officer in the room turned to watch her. The authority in the room had subtly but completely transferred. "They're trying to fix us in place," she said, her voice cutting through the fear. "This is the second phase. They'll use the structural attack to cover a new infiltration. Not a mass assault. A small kill team. Their objective will be you, Colonel." She looked directly at Madsen. "They know they can't take the base now, so they're going for a decapitation strike. They'll trade a dozen of their own for the FOB's commander." Madsen stared at her, the last vestiges of his pride warring with the cold, hard logic of her words. He had a choice. Reassert his failing command or trust the woman who had just been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. He swallowed. "What's your read?" he asked. The question was a surrender, a plea. Alara pointed to the map. "They failed in the south. The west is a stalemate. They'll come from the northeast. Through the blind spot in the tower's fields of fire I noted this afternoon. They'll cut through the maintenance access gate behind the motor pool. It's a standard chain link, not reinforced." The sergeant from the motor pool, who had come to the CP for orders, went pale. He knew the gate. It was secured with a simple padlock. "You need to move your last reserve element, what's left of Alpha Company's 3rd platoon, not to the perimeter but here," she said, drawing a small circle around a cluster of empty storage containers midway between the motor pool and the command post. "Set up an internal ambush. Killbox. Don't reinforce the gate. Let them through. You engage them here in the open, away from any cover." It was counterintuitive. It was a gamble. It meant letting the enemy inside the wire. But it was a plan. A clear, decisive course of action in the midst of chaos. Madsen looked at Major Kenji, who simply nodded, his eyes fixed on Alara. The colonel took a deep breath. "Do it," he said to his radio operator. "Relay those orders to Alpha's platoon leader." Exactly as she described, he then looked at Alara. The second test was underway. She hadn't just been asked for an observation. She had been asked for a strategy. She was now, de facto, running the defense of FOB Sentinel. She stood by the map, listening to the radio traffic, her face an unreadable mask, as the orders went out and men's lives were wagered on her judgment. The next 20 minutes were the longest in Colonel Madsen's life. The RPG impacts on the command post lessened, then stopped. The enemy was on the move. The radio was eerily quiet, broken only by the hiss of static and the occasional, clipped confirmation from the ambush platoon leader that they were in position. Madsen found himself watching Alara, not the tactical plot. She stood motionless, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing the battle unfold not on a map, but in her mind's eye. She was replaying the geometry of the base, the likely path of the kill team, the fields of fire for the hidden platoon. A call came in on the encrypted satellite phone, a high-priority channel that had been painstakingly reestablished by a desperate comms sergeant. It was Central Command. Major Kenji answered, his voice tight. Sentinel CP, go ahead. The voice on the other end was a 3-star general, the theater commander. His voice was gravelly with impatience. Kenji, what the hell is going on down there? Your whole grid has been a black hole for the last hour. Give me a situation report now. Kenji gave a rapid, condensed version of the attack, the feint, the stalled southern assault, the ongoing infiltration attempt. We are currently repositioning assets to intercept an enemy element believed to be inside the wire. Believed to be? The general barked. Who is running this defense, Major? Madsen's reports usually read like a cavalry charge. This sounds tactical. Madsen took the handset. General, this is Colonel Madsen. The situation is under control. We were advised of the enemy's likely course of action. Advised? By who? Your intel officer. No, sir, Madsen said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. By the civilian strategic advisor attached to our unit. A Ms. Alara Vance. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. The only sound was the faint crackle of the satellite link. Madsen could picture the general in his vast, climate-controlled command center thousands of miles away, frowning at this unexpected data point. Vance? The general finally said, the name sounding strange. Spell that name for me. Madsen spelled it. Another pause, longer this time. Madsen could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard in the background. Colonel, the general said, his tone completely changed. It had lost its edge of impatience and was now laced with something else. Oh, caution. Ask your advisor a question for me. Ask her if she was ever known by the call sign Carice. The name meant nothing to Madsen. It sounded like a random string of letters. He looked over at Alara, who had not appeared to be listening but now turned her head slightly, her pale blue eyes meeting his. He didn't even have to ask the question. He saw the answer in her gaze. It was a flicker of memory, a shadow of a life lived long ago, in places that didn't officially exist. Sir, Madsen said into the phone, his own voice now hushed. I don't think I need to ask. A sudden burst of controlled, disciplined gunfire erupted from the direction of the motor pool. A sharp staccato of M4S, punctuated by the heavier cough of a squad automatic weapon. The ambush had been sprung. The general's voice was deadly serious on the phone. Colonel, listen to me very carefully. The person in your command post is not a logistician. Carice was the operational call sign for the commander of Project Chimera, the most lethal Black Ops unit this military has ever produced. They were officially disbanded in '08. Their files are sealed at the highest level. You will give that woman anything she asks for. You will follow her orders without question. Is that clear? Madsen stared at Alara, this quiet, unassuming woman in her late 50s, and saw something else entirely. He saw the ghost the general was describing. Carice, in Greek mythology, the spirits of violent death. The name settled over the room, explaining the impossible grenade, the preternatural calm, the flawless strategy. The mystery was solved. The firefight near the motor pool was short and brutal. The enemy kill team, expecting a clear path to a panicked command center, walked directly into the kill box. The ambush was perfect. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes. The radio call from Alpha's platoon leader was calm and professional. Target element eliminated. We're clear. The tension in the command post didn't just break. It evaporated. A collective, shuddering breath was released. Officers slumped against consoles, the adrenaline finally leaving them. The base was secure. The attack was broken. Colonel Madsen slowly placed the satellite phone back in its cradle. He stood for a long moment, his back to the room, processing the general's words and the events of the last hour. Carice, Project Chimera. He was a career infantry officer, a colonel. He had thought he existed at the sharp end of the spear. He now understood that he had been living in a brightly lit room, entirely unaware of the true darkness where people like Alara Vance operated. He turned around. The room was a mess of discarded equipment, dust, and spent nerves. In the middle of it all, Alara stood by the map, her posture unchanged. She was looking at the board, but her focus seemed to be on the aftermath, the next steps. Casualty reports, ammunition counts, structural assessments. Her work was not done. Madsen walked toward her, his steps heavy on the metal floor. The other officers in the room fell silent, watching. They had all heard the general's side of the conversation. They had all put the pieces together. They were all looking at her with a new, profound sense of reverence and fear. He stopped directly in front of her. For the first time, he looked her in the eye, truly seeing her. He saw the immense, weary depth in her gaze. He saw the quiet competence that he had so arrogantly mistaken for meekness. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words felt cheap and inadequate. What could he say? He had ordered a living legend to stand down. He had told a master of war to stay out of the way. So he did the only thing that felt right. He stood up straight, his back rigid, and brought his hand up in a sharp, perfect salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture he might give a visiting dignitary. It was the salute a soldier gives to a commander they respect, a salute of deep, earned deference. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but clear. Major Kenji, standing by his console, straightened up and saluted as well. Then, one by one, every other soldier in the command post, the young lieutenants, the grizzled sergeant major, the comm specialists, even PFC Lee, who had been frozen by the door, turned to face her and rendered a salute. There was no order given. It was a spontaneous, unanimous gesture of respect. Alara Vance did not salute back. She was a civilian now. Instead, she held their gaze for a moment, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. She gave a single, slow nod. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. In the quiet, dusty command post, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle she had won for them, her dignity, which had never truly been absent, was finally recognized. The respect she had never asked for was now hers completely. The sun rose the next morning over a base that was battered but not broken. The air, which had been thick with cordite and fear, now smelled of dust and the clean, sharp scent of the desert dawn. The sounds of battle had been replaced by the clatter of cleanup crews and the low murmur of soldiers recounting the night's events in hushed, awestruck tones. The story of the ricochet grenade was already becoming legend. In the temporary quiet of her assigned quarters, Alara Vance packed her single duffel bag. She folded her clothes with the same neat, economical motions she applied to everything. There was nothing for her to do here anymore. Her assessment was complete. She had observed, she had advised, and when necessary, she had acted. Her report would be brief. It would list the deficiencies she had found and the corrective actions taken. It would not mention her own involvement. It would be a sterile, professional document just like her official file. Colonel Madsen found her as she was walking toward the landing pad where a helicopter waited, its rotors beginning a slow, lazy spin. He walked in step with her, the silence between them comfortable now, stripped of all previous tension. "Your report," he began, not sure how to phrase it. "It can say whatever you want it to say. I'll sign it without reading it." Alara looked at him. "My report will say that FOB Sentinel encountered a complex, coordinated attack and repelled it due to the sound training and resilient leadership of its commander." Madsen stopped walking. "That's not what happened. It's what the record will show," she said. It was not a lie. It was a kindness, a professional courtesy. She was closing the book, erasing her own role to preserve the integrity of the unit and its command structure. She was a ghost, and ghosts left no trace. As she neared the helicopter, PFC Lee and PFC Rostova were standing nearby, ostensibly on guard duty but clearly waiting for her. Lee held 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He stepped forward hesitantly and offered one to her. "Ma'am, we wanted to say thank you." Alara paused and took the mug. She held its warmth in her hands for a moment, the simple gesture of gratitude more meaningful than any official commendation. She took a slow sip, her pale eyes looking out over the base. She saw the repaired fence line, the mechanics swarming the damaged vehicles with a new, focused intensity, and the soldiers moving with a renewed sense of purpose. The base was stronger this morning, not just because it had survived, but because it had been tested and had learned. She handed the mug back to Lee. "Stay sharp, soldier. Watch your spacing." She gave a final nod to Madsen, then turned and walked up the ramp into the belly of the helicopter without looking back. The ramp closed, the whine of the turbines rose to a scream, and the aircraft lifted off, kicking up a storm of dust. Colonel Madsen stood watching it go, flanked by the 2 young soldiers. They watched until the helicopter was just a dark speck against the vast, blue sky. The base she had saved was laid out before them, its scars visible but its spirit intact. Her presence had been a storm, brief and violent, that had cleared the air. All that remained was the quiet, the earned respect, and the lingering symbolic image of her solitary figure walking away, her shadow long in the morning sun, her legend reborn not in a file or a citation, but in the memory of the soldiers whose lives she had saved.